Now that we're in the off season, I have a confession to make. I never played the Trial of the Ancestors League mechanic. The interface was clunky, picking a team felt largely irrelevant, the enemy AI was cheap and lazy, and the whole experience was just boring. As somebody who enjoys actual tower defense games, I can't stand ToTA and find it overrated. I liked the core idea and hope they bring it back, but only with major refinements and redesign. So this was an interesting post that I came across, and given my own personal lack of engagement and interest with the ToTA League mechanic, I can definitely say that new League mechanics, even the ones that don't go core, are not for everyone. Grinding Gear Games has always been willing to take risks when testing new League mechanics, and even though this has created some of the most enjoyable and fun challenge leagues for many players, it has also been responsible for some of the less popular and boring ones as well. I'm gonna be honest, I haven't touched the League mechanics since Sanctum, and before that, Sentinel. Playing this week's event made me realize how much I miss in-map League mechanics. Last 4 leagues added nothing to normal gameplay, had a lot of fun learning Sanctum or mixing crangled items, but monsters and loot while mapping are much more fun. And this is the result of Grinding Gear Games' ambitious approach to keeping PoE fresh and interesting every season. Even though they release very popular and streamlined mechanics such as Sentinel, Beyond, or Delirium, the downside to their seasonal releases is that every now and then you will have less intuitive mechanics like Heist, Sanctum, or ToTA. Yes please, I want to kill a ton of monsters and go fast and see explosions, not sit in a corner knocking back enemies and crying about turtles. I touched Sanctum, learned from my mistake, and never touched ToTA. Sentinel was too good. Using ToTA to level was something the community appreciated, I think. On the other hand, lots of people want an in-the-map mechanic next, and this is exactly what many players are looking for. What they want is a new League mechanic that seamlessly integrates into their favorite pastime in PoE. And one of the most popular things to do in a top-down ARPG like Path of Exile is to turn off your brain and blast maps for hours on end. But what about the players who did spend time interacting with the ToTA League mechanic? Did they do so out of enjoyment for the new mechanic, or were there other reasons? I'm gonna be honest, I hated every second of ToTA. I played solely for the purpose of printing easy money. ToTA isn't fun, it's only rewarding. And as much as people might deny this reality, there will always be players who are willing to interact with less enjoyable mechanics just simply because they believe it to be more profitable. But did ToTA really produce such incredible rewards that players were willing to go through the grind of ranking up their characters in the trials on top of building specialized characters that couldn't do any other mechanic in the game? I feel like ToTA wasn't actually that rewarding compared to other things. The big thing that it had though was a pseudo gambling aspect like stacked decks. The most interesting part of it was looking through the rewards each round to see if you hit something big. And this was an interesting point made by this commenter because it touches upon a common psychological phenomenon that plenty of game devs take advantage of, and that is the thrill of anticipation. A behavior where excitement or pleasure is experienced in the anticipation or expectation of a future event, often to a greater degree than the actual event happening itself. And this is actually how many players draw the connection between playing PoE or going to the casino. Because although the stakes are very different in each respective case, the similarities lie in the fact that players are excited with the anticipation of a reward rather than receiving the reward itself. It's one of the mechanics that if you happen to like it, it's rewarding enough to keep you competitive with other methods like Heist or Delve. But if the only reason you are playing it is to make money, there are way better methods of doing so. So even with the thrill of anticipation incorporated into ToTA's design, is basically common knowledge that there are plenty of other fun ways to gamble your time in PoE as well. Take for example the divination card harvest gamble. From a game design perspective, I wouldn't argue that this is the most complicated or intellectually engaging mechanic in the game, but it does still draw a lot of player interaction purely on the basis that you know it's possible to double your investment even with the risk of losing it all. But with this all taken into consideration, are there really any players that think ToTA was a good League mechanic? I hope that it goes core but more refined. I played the shit out of it, but because of the rewards, but it has good things too. It's a whole separate activity that you can play all day with dedicated loot. People make new characters with new builds exclusively to play it. This and Sanctum expanded the game in a good way in my opinion. Now something that many players within the PoE community typically complain about is the concept of limited build diversity. There are many players who believe that the amount of viable builds is slowly shrinking and constantly wish for either a meta shift shift in the most popular builds, or even an expansion of builds that can effectively clear all content on a shoestring budget. And although the introduction of things like ToTA or Sanctum might not give rise to builds that meet these impossible standards, they do expand the amount of build options that players will pick from in terms of the endgame content they wish to pursue. And in my opinion, that's a far better approach to increasing build diversity than necessarily pumping out more one-size-fits-all builds. I had fun up until maybe 500 rating. After that, it just became way too hard. It stopped being fun, and even though the rewards were insane, I just preferred doing maps and forgetting ToTA even existed, to be honest. So although this player did enjoy ToTA at first, the limiting factor to his enjoyment was actually a skill issue. And as funny as that might sound, this is something that game developers have to take into consideration when designing new league mechanics. And that is essentially what game balance is all about. Is this something that we can ramp up the difficulty further, or do we have to dial back the difficulty a bit so that players can start to justify the opportunity cost? Loved it. Played to rank 2000 with no cheese. I only used a couple of units, but I loved them and they were clearly relevant. Good units for my build with good items were doing everything. AI could have been better and it was missing a PvP mode. Mid-nerf to spamming the same unit was weird. Mass building the same unit should be weak but allowed. Go play Blight and stop comparing a 12v12 totem ball match to a tower defense. And what's interesting about this feedback is that the player didn't mention anything about the rewards system. Although his response to the ToTA League mechanic was positive overall, what leads me to believe that he genuinely enjoyed the league mechanic was that there wasn't a single mention about how he felt forced to do ToTA at all. But another argument I've seen for why people don't interact with the ToTA mechanic was because it required playing a cheesy build that rendered all of its dangers useless. And so this had me wondering, is it always necessary to cheese the new league mechanics? Don't worry, everyone agrees that the gameplay was utter dog shit, and everyone who played had a build which cheesed it so they could avoid the gameplay. The amazing rewards were the only reason it was popular. Every time someone says this, there are people saying I enjoyed it with a regular build, and every time it's either a minion or totem build. I didn't follow a guide for the cheese builds and came up with one on my own, but it's probably about the same. Made more currency than I ever had before with a mechanic, but I didn't really feel like I was playing it. So according to these players and the many who agreed with them, the ToTA League mechanic was really only popular if you played from a small subset of specialized build archetypes. But scrolling a little bit further in the comments, it didn't seem to be the case that everybody agreed with the sentiment. Haven't gotten to 2k rating yet, but had loads of fun running it with Corrupting Fever. I had a lot of fun farming 2k on the same Frostblades character that I did every other challenge on. I enjoyed it with Cold Dot build in Ruthless, got to 2000 and rewards were shit apart from 1/6 link Omen, but it was fun anyways. And that is truly the beauty of Path of Exile. Even though one player may experience a certain mechanic one way, there are plenty of players who will experience the exact same mechanic in their own fun and unique way as well. But the original comment by Sir Sock actually sparked an interesting discussion, and this was basically a discussion about what exactly does it mean to cheese a league mechanic? Isn't that basically the definition of PoE gameplay? Because if you really think about it, cheesing a mechanic basically involves mitigating all the downsides from interacting with it in the first place. If we were to take general mapping gameplay for example, building defenses on your character is a way of mitigating the downside of your character dying too much. Would this make building defenses on your character a cheesy interaction? The one truth about PoE is that if a league mechanic makes the number go up fast, then the gambling addicts will scream that it's a fantastic mechanic and need to go core. Meanwhile, I'm over here like, why do you like Sanctum? Y'all are just cheesing rooms with zero risk, and it's probably the worst roguelike implementation I've ever seen. And what's interesting about this argument is that it does take the stance that by cheesing the Sanctum mechanic and mitigating all the risks involved, all the fun is effectively lost. But what I think this player fails to realize is that Path of Exile is also a game that massively rewards players who appreciate the concept of delayed gratification. Sometimes it's not so much about making the 10 divines every 15 minutes in Sanctum, but appreciating the process it takes to get there. Everybody knows that with any specialized build, regardless of the currency price tag, it requires a pretty thorough amount of research into understanding how the build interacts with specific mechanics. And what I believe players truly enjoy is being able to invest themselves into learning the fundamentals of a new build that will eventually grant them a massive payout later. And so that's all for this video. If you want to find out why Path of Exile will never be a pay-to-win game, check out this next video.